This evening we're going to talk a little bit about Tachanun, about the evolution of prayers. I guess what does if we were to try to reconstruct Nusach Eretz Yisrael, like many are trying to do today, we'd like to know what is Tachanun, what is it meant to be, what did it mean to Chazal, what practices have been resurrected of late, and what it means for us. So let's go into some historical background. Uh, we have in the Mishnah tells us how to say Kriyat Shema. You look in the Mishnah, it says, well, Kriyat Shema consists of this, the recitation of Shema plus blessings before and after, evening and morning. So the structure of how Kriyat Shema is supposed to be, morning and night, is quite well defined by halacha. And then we know that the sages talked about Shemona Esrei immediately following that, and Shemona Esrei, which is also called the Amidah or the Tefillah, is I guess also quite well defined in halacha. It's quite well defined, and the order of the brachot, even though we've seen slight differences, and of course there's different nuschot, different versions of how exactly the brachot are to be formulated. The essential points are dictated by Chazal. There's even a Gemara there saying why the specific order is what it is. So that is pretty much set. But then we do not find a statement, let's say, and after prayer or after the silent devotion, fall down on one's face when one should recite these various supplications. We don't find a statement to that, but we do find it strongly implied. For example, there's a classic story over here. This is in Bava Basra, the 59th page. It tells the story of the excommunication of Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus. And it talks about how there was for whatever reason, it was a dry machloket. It wasn't a controversy that people should have taken so personally, talking about the purity of this particular oven called the Tanur of Achnai, whatever that may be. And Rabbi Eliezer really insisted on his position despite being outvoted. And he invoked all sorts of divine intervention to prove his point. If I'm correct, let the walls of the Beit Midrash prove it, let the river prove it, let the trees prove it. And the other Chachamim really protested. Eventually, they excommunicated him. The excommunication was done under the authority of Rabban Gamliel II. That's the Rabban Gamliel who served right after the destruction of the Second Temple. I think I saw that he died in the year 119 about. Rabban Gamliel maybe didn't feel so strongly about this particular excommunication. It doesn't show him as a disputant of Rabbi Eliezer, but he was the main, he was the person who had to sign on. He was in charge. So he basically bore the divine responsibility for putting Rabbi Eliezer in Cherem. And it says there's a story here about how he felt that the storm he was experiencing at sea was perhaps a punishment for this. And that's what I'm highlighting over here. And he prayed and said, he basically told God, it's not my fault. I didn't do this for my own honor. This was done for the honor of my office. And the storm subsided. And that tells you about how Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was actually Rabbi Gamliel's brother-in-law. He was married to Rabbi Gamliel's sister, known as Ima Shalom, Mother Peace. And it says here that she would, from that day on, since her husband was excommunicated, prevent him. It says Lo Havashav Galei. She prevented him. The Rabbi Eliezer lemepal ala pei. She didn't let him fall down on his face. That is apparently in prayer. And then one day she forgot. Perhaps she thought it was Rosh Chodesh, and it turns out it wasn't. Or some say she went to answer the door to answer the call of a beggar who needed just a piece of bread or something. And she then turned around and found, he had said his tachanun. Ashkachte dinafal al anpeh. Here it says apeh without the nun. Here it's with the nun. So apayim has a dot in the pay to make up for the missing nun in certain constructs. And she told him, kum ka katalit, or kum katalit le'achi. Get up, you are killing my brother. And adhachi nafak shipur mibeit Rabbi Gamliel de shachiv. And then they suddenly heard the announcement saying from Rabbi Gamliel's house that he had passed away. So apparently the fact that he fell down on his face in supplication is what brought about God's intervention and killed Rabbi Gamliel, apparently the one who was responsible for causing Rabbi Eliezer, the great pious person, a righteous person, all this suffering. So he asked her, "How did you know that that would happen?" And she says, "I have a tradition from my father's father, his house." Is that talking about King David, or is it talking about just Hillel the Nasi? I don't know. Don't forget the Hillel was descended somehow in a matrilineal line to King David, but a lot of people would be also. So he's not exactly real true Davidians. And their tradition was is that all the gates can be locked except for the gate of ona'ah, which is oppression by mouth. That someone uses his words to cause another to feel bad. So we learn a few things from this. The Rishonim learn a few things from this. That's why I have the Tova note here. That the Ikar Nefilah B'Shvil Tachanonim, which would be that apparently when one is supposed to fall down on his face, it's in order to supplicate. It's in order to offer prayers that aren't the usual prayers. It's usually in times of distress. And also that's supposed to be right after the tefillah. When we say tefillah min hastam, by default, tefillah is referring to the Shemon Esrei, the Amidah, the prayer that is supposed to be standing. And also, we see that this nefilat apayim, falling down the face with the supplications, tachanunim, is not a Rosh Chodesh. And apparently, if it's not a Rosh Chodesh for whatever reason, it shouldn't be on other days that are like Rosh Chodesh. Oh, sorry about that. For example, the Sabbath, Yomim Tovim, Chol Hamoed, days like that. The Beit Yosef also brings in the name of the Talmidei of the Rashba in that same parak, and it says they inferred Shmikan Shein Leber Bein Tefillah Tchina. So too, one should not. I shouldn't be it over here. One should not speak. That is, interrupt his prayer between his prayer and his supplication, his tachanun. How do we know that? Because Ima Shalom basically was interfering. She would let him eventually fall down on his face. Because what do you mean? You think that she would just stop him and say, no tachanun today, no tachanun any day, and he just kept trying and wondering why she would stop him. No, it means that she would interrupt him. She would interrupt his concentration, cause a hefsek in between them. Apparently, the efficacy of the supplications is greatly lessened if one is unable to have them immediately follow the Amidah. So these are a number of things we learned from this simple story. Now you could say that this is, I guess, similar. The fact that it has to, for whatever reason, the proper form of the prayer, the Tachanun, is immediately after Shemon Esrei. So too, Chazal said that the bracha of Ga'al Yisrael, what they call Geula, should immediately precede the Shemon Esrei also. So I guess whatever power that they have, whatever that may be, has to do with the proximity and the fact that these things follow each other. I'm going to move away from the window a little bit. Okay, now you see the base medrash, a better view. This also is in distinction for what we find that they would do in the temple. I pointed out here that in Tachanun is reserved for those who are in trouble, times of distress. It's not fit for days that are, I guess, more joyous, more for celebration. And it's part and parcel with this act of falling down on one's face. That's why you would find, for example, that on days of distress or in days of increased prayer, there is more Tachanunim. The Rambam himself says, of all the holidays, only Tachanun is fit for Yom Kippur because they fall on their face and say Tachanunim all day long. It's the great day of judgment. Rosh Hashanah is explicit in the Bible that, no, you're supposed to rejoice. You're not supposed to be supplicating. You're not supposed to be crying. Yes, there is an aspect of Yom Hadin. However, it's also Yom Tov, and there is Simchat Yom Tov. Yom Kippur doesn't have it. One of the main aspects of Simchat Yom Tov is eating, feasting, and Yom Kippur that is expressly prohibited. As a matter of fact, the mitzvah of the day on Yom Kippur is affliction. One should afflict himself. So it's sort of the opposite of Yom Tov, even though it is a Sabbath, just like the Sabbath prohibited in all these malachot. In the temple, what would they do? They would have a point in the service every day, morning and evening, as part of the Tamid. And here, this is taken straight from the Mishnah over here. This is the fifth parak, and over here we have from the sixth parak, of when the priests, including the high priest, would go into the Kodesh and prostrate themselves. It says, Kohen Shehu Shomeat Kolah, when they would throw down this magrifa, one of these utensils that they used at the altar. It was large and made out of apparently bronze. It made a loud noise when they threw it down, and that was meant as a sign, the alarm for everybody, for the Kohanim to know that they could go into the Kodesh to bow down. So they'd all run to go and do it. And the Kohen Gadol also would enter the Kodesh. If he was doing the Torah that day, it was his choice. So normally they had a lottery, but don't forget the Kohen Gadol, if he could choose to never serve in the temple, unless it's Yom Kippur when he has to. The Yom Kippur service was performed only by the Kohen Gadol. But all the other days he could take off, or he could just say, you know what, I choose to do this service no matter what, and I choose this service and I choose that service. And the usual procedures for determining which Kohen on duty, on rotation, gets to perform that service is overridden. And it says that the Kohen Gadol would then have a chance over here. Once everybody cleared the Kodesh, that's as we saw, the outer room of the temple, in which the menorah was standing, the golden altar, the table for the showbread, and he would bow towards the Holy of Holies. And it says here that they would also lift up the parochet, and then he would bow down. And the other Kohanim would then have a chance to also bow down. This bowing has nothing to do with Tachanunim. We don't see that they would utter any prayers. It was just part of the service. So we see here this distinction between Tachanun outside the temple, Nifilat Apayim outside the temple, and Nifilat Apayim falling down one's face within the temple. In the temple, it's a daily occurrence, twice daily. It's part of the service. Outside the temple, it's only on days perhaps when it's fit to supplicate. Within the temple, it's not connected to supplication. It's just part of the service. Whereas outside the temple, it is part and parcel of supplication. The proper way to supplicate is to fall down on one's face. And just like there's certain days when Tachanun is inappropriate, so too falling down on one's face is inappropriate. In the temple, it is permitted on cut stone. And as we saw, the halacha is that, at least according to the way the Rambam has in the common practice, then when we say temple, we mean the entire Temple Mount. The entire Temple Mount has one status of holy temple, and therefore the permission to bow down on the cut stones of the temple applies throughout the Temple Mount, as long as one is bowing in the right direction. However, outside the temple, it's forbidden to bow down on cut stones. Instead, we saw that one has to put some sort of barrier, perhaps Rambam says a carpet, put down some grasses or something, so that one is not directly on the stone. And that's our practice nowadays. If we do see someone prostrate himself, nowadays they basically, outside the temple, the only days you see it is sometimes on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, in certain places. For whatever reason, we're going to get into that. Why don't we do it every day then? We'll see. One cannot bow down directly on stones. Here in Israel, a lot of floors are made of stone. I remember in the synagogue, which we mostly prayed on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur back in New York, it had carpeting. As a matter of fact, most of the synagogues had carpeting. Yet came Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and men were taking out special covers or prayer rugs in order to bow down directly on the floor. And that didn't make much sense because the floor was already covered. Whereas here in Israel, you look like most of the Batei Midrash I've been to in this country and shuls have stone floors, and then that would be an issue. Let's see over here. There's a Rabbeinu Manoach points out that in Solomon's prayers, when he dedicated the temple, Techina usually follows Tefillah. He asks God to listen to his Tefillah, his prayer, and his Techina. And then a few psukim later, it says, when Solomon finished Litpalel Hashem, to pray to God, Et kol Tefillah v'Techina, this Tefillah and Techina. You'll notice the word Tefillah and Techina, they both have a dot, a dagesh, and the letter preceding the silent hey. In this case, Tefillah, the noun meaning prayer, is from the shoresh. Usually shoresh is how you create verbs and adjectives and participles in Hebrew. The shoresh is pei lamed lamed. The lamed falls out, one of the lameds falls out, and to compensate for that, we have a dot, a dagesh, in the remaining lamed to geminate it. So it's not tefillah, it's tefillah, a short chirik sound, and it's as though there's two lameds. The first syllable is tefil, and the second syllable is la. Same thing with tichina. The shoresh is chet nun nun, and in this form, one of the nuns falls out. So we geminate, we put a dagesh in the remaining nun in order to compensate for the missing nun. So this is tehina, and it's as though there's two nuns. One nun is part of the previous syllable, and one nun is part of the next syllable. Okay, enough grammar for today. We have here examples in Masechet Brachot on the 16th page of all these various private and personal supplications that various Tanaim and Amorim inserted into their prayers. And it says after they would pray. So this could mean one of two things. Either it's talking about after the final blessing of the Amidah, Sim Shalom or Shalom Rav, after one says, Amvarechet Amo Yisrael B'Shalom, and Usually that's where the Chazan also, if he's repeating the Shemon Esrei, that's where he would end off. That's officially the end. Or he says, Oseh Shalom according to Nusach Eretz Yisrael. Once again, we saw that Nusach remained among the Ashkenazim just for high holy days, but see that you could see why they held on to it. It was the old Israeli tradition. So we're familiar with what's printed in our Siddur, the Elokai Nitzor L'Shneim Yirah prayer. That was one of these prayers, but we see that there's a few examples here. We have from Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yochanan over here, Rabbi Zera over here. After they prayed, this is what they would say. And we're familiar with some of these prayers, actually. We see that some of them have made it back into the Siddur, not necessarily after Shemon Esrei. So this is either referring to that time after Shemon Esrei while one is still standing and before he takes his 3 steps back and bows a little bit to his left, to his right, and straight ahead. Or this could be referring to the Tachanunim. And there's quite a few examples. I didn't even count all of them. I highlighted where they start in the text. And one who has time should go through this and see which of these prayers is appropriate for him. But what we do see here is that there is no one text for any of these things. Once you finish that bracha of shalom at Shemon Esrei, it's pretty open. It's time for, like my children were told in school, my daughters are praying there. They said that they then declare there's time for tefillah ishit, one's personal prayer. Say what you want, say what you really feel, ask God for something. And that's basically what the sages were doing. We also don't find for example, the Rambam saying that you have to use a particular text. We're going to see that inside very shortly. We also have examples from the prophets, starting with Abraham, how they would fall down on their faces in prayer. Moshe Rabbeinu, especially in times of trouble, for those doing the 1-year cycle of the Torah reading, you'll see this week's parasha, Moshe Rabbeinu's immediate reaction to the whole Korach, instigation, was to fall down on his face in prayer before God. And we see that he did that a number of times. He says here that, we have other examples from other Nevi'im, that's also a proper thing to do. So here is the structure of the prayer. Rambam, in his formulation, says that there are certain things that are critical for prayer. In order to pray, one has to be dressed properly, one has to wash his hands, etc. And that's in the chapter 4 of Hilchot Tefillah. In the 5th chapter, he begins with things that are, he says here, einan makfin, things that are not critical. That is, for whatever reason, one can't have it, so he should pray anyways. For example, he can't face the temple for whatever reason. Let's say he doesn't know which way the temple is. He's so far away. And another example, he says, being able to talk with the right, modulate one's voice over here, being in the exact right place, standing, for example. One can't exactly stand. This example on an airplane, like Rav Shechter says, standing in the aisles and making minyanim is not right on an airplane. You should just pray sitting at your seat. So in such a case, it's pretty hard to stand and to face the temple. And one of the examples he gives you over here is called kriyah. Kriyah means bowing, but not the kind that we're talking about in Tachanunim. This is talking about the bowing that we still have while standing up at the first blessing of Shemon Esrei, the second to last blessing, and the final 5th bowing that one does when one concludes the prayer, the one I just mentioned before, left, right, and center. And then he says something called hishtachavaya. So what is hishtachavaya? That's part of the prayer. And this is very interesting that in all these examples, he's talking about what Shemon Esrei is, and this hishtachavaya is precisely something after Shemon Esrei. Hishtachavaya ketzad, he says a few halachot later, still in the 5th parak over here, is it Yud Daled or Yud Gimel? It depends which edition of the Rambam you have. After he lifts his head up from that 5th bowing, he took his 3 steps back and bowed. He goes low on the ground and he falls on his face toward the ground. So he's talking about prostration right here. And he supplicates with all the various forms of supplications that he wants. Remember, no strict text over here. This is a time that a person should perhaps be speaking from his heart. Rambam earlier said in the 2nd chapter of these halachot that really it used to be that everybody prayed. They prayed what they could based on how eloquent they are and how intelligent they were, what they could get out of their hearts, transfer properly from the heart to the mouth. Yet here he's saying he's giving it back. He's giving the power back to the people. Sages ordained what to say. We call that Shemon Esrei, but here it's still quite open. And then he defines by what kriyah is. Kriyah mura b'chol makom ala birkaim, except for this kriyah over here. When we talk about someone who's stam koreah, he's talking about on his knees, getting on his knees, and this is the form of bowing that has always been people have been for the last few months. People have been getting away with on the Temple Mount because the bad guys don't realize that this form of bowing are the people actually when they suddenly get on their knees for whatever reason they're actually bowing down. Kida alapayim. That's what we see in, for example, the common practice on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. One puts his face to the ground after getting on his knees. One goes down on his face. Hishtachavaya is pishut yadayim v'raglayim, spreading out the hands and legs entirely. You see someone flat on the floor. Ad shnimsa mutal al panav al aretz. That's what he's talking about over here, and that's what people do because here he says hishtachavaya, and there's three ways to go about doing it. Some do it this way, some do that way, some actually go this way. You don't really see that much anymore, and we're going to see why. The next halacha says that when some people bow down after tefillah, that's the Shemona Esrei, you see that they do kida. Some do hashtachavaya. And as we saw before, it is forbidden for one to bow down on these stone, the cut stone. These are halachot that we mentioned before, so we'll skip them over here. And then he says, this is also based on Chazal. He takes this from the Gemara. Ein adam chashuv rashai lipol panav elim kain hu yodea b'atzmo shu tzadik Yeshua. An important person should not fall down on his face unless he's confident that he'll be answered like Joshua. Now, most of us are not important people, and we don't have confidence anyways. It's just talking about, let's say, an important person. Joshua basically was a king in his time. He was the ruler of the Jewish people and their undisputed leader. Even more than Moses, he didn't really suffer the same trouble that Moshe Rabbeinu had. As a matter of fact, people basically pledged their allegiance to him right when he took power. But he should he should move his face a little bit to the side. So you see here already the beginnings of why people might not bow exactly. First of all, I said, if you're important, if you're not confident you're going to be answered, so people would say, well, we know that we're nobodies and God isn't going to answer us, so maybe we shouldn't be so presumptuous and do this. And also it talks about putting your face to the side. You can see why you're already losing some of it. And he says here, of course, he throws in that Yom Kippur is a day when they say Tachnun all the time. We already have the beginnings of when people stop doing this. In interest, because we might be short on time, we'll jump to the bottom line right now about how it eventually disappeared. There is a Kabbalistic idea. I don't have it on the screen right now. I should download it, but I can't. It's one of the Kabbalistic Sfarim. I'll look it over here. I'll open it up. Basically, it talks about the extreme danger in which one can find himself if he were to immediately fall down on his face in supplication right after Shemona Esrei. I do not profess to understand these Kabbalistic ideas. It's in the, let's say, for instance, Shar Nefilas Apayim. It's in the.
It's in the Ben Ish Chai.
No, it's not the Ben Ish Chai. No, it's not the Ben Ish Chai. It was one of the Bar-Hayim. One of the Sfarim I have over there, but when I have the picture over here and it doesn't say the name of the Sefer on top, it just says the Shar, Yud Gimel, Shar, and the Nefilas Apayim, and Vitchalik Lishisha Prakim. It's one of those Lurianic Kabbalistic Sefers. The Rosh Kola was making me read it yesterday. So it's not the Ben Ish Chai, that I'm sure of. I can't put it on the screen here. Oh well, whatever. We will maybe next week we'll have it there. But it talks about this danger that one could find himself if he goes all the way from standing straight up and falling straight down. Now, of course, it's not talking literally. There is some sort of danger, and they decry it. So you can understand why it is eventually in Sephardic circles that, and you probably have never seen it. At least in Ashkenazic circles, you see, like in the Mishnah Berurah, people are already falling down on their arm, and people forget that when they do that, they should actually be facing at least Jerusalem. It's in lieu of bowing down, and they're doing it in sitting position, so they should at least be facing the right direction. I remember Rabbi Elio Soloveitchik used to point this out. Rabbanim in the yeshiva, so they're sitting and facing the rest of the students, and the students are facing ostensibly toward Jerusalem. The Rabbanim have their backs to Jerusalem when they're sitting down, and then they fall down on their face like that, and that's a little bit strange because it's as though they're bowing, so now they're bowing in the wrong direction. Which hand does one bow on? Okay, that became an issue. The Vilna Gaon says just do on your left hand, and some say no, you should do on your right hand because your tefillin are on your left hand. I guess if you're a lefty, that's a little bit more complicated. At mincha, you're not wearing tefillin. Why aren't you wearing tefillin at mincha? You should be wearing your tefillin all day. So do like the Vilna Gaon apparently, but you see that this these are all replacements for what really was. Those who are romantic for Nusach Eretz Yisrael and don't have all these considerations that have been slowly moving us away, and don't forget the power of societal norms. Just like people wear tefillin and talit a lot less. Why in the Western world did that disappear? Because it's inconvenient. It sticks out. We've become distant from our own land, so people don't put their tefillin on and their talit back on for mincha. It's a little bit awkward. We now sit in synagogues which have pews and stenders and seats. In most synagogues, it can't just suddenly have everybody room to fall down on their face as part of the service. It's just not done anymore. It's awkward. It's all Middle Eastern. All these factors contribute to causing uh, an essential part of prayer disappearing. But it's coming back. There are some people that mentioned that you could find in Rav Shaki's Sidur, for example. He says he just quotes this Rambam as it was. Rambam assumes that people would fall down on their face, part and parcel of the Tachanunim after the Shemon Esrei. And of course, now it's been getting better on the Temple Mount. Now people are bowing down as they should in supplication as part of their daily prayers, or sometimes just because it's the Temple Mount, Yishtachavu Lashem Bar Kodesh, or Yishtachavu Lahar Kodsho. You have to bow down on this holy mountain. That's a good thing. So it's making a comeback. There is also this idea. What are we going to say about it? Oh wait, never mind. We'll get to it. We'll get to it afterwards. Here we have how the Torah formulates this whole idea. He basically says that the Rambam says that after Chazarat HaShatz, that's when it's time to fall down our face in prayer. And he quotes the Rambam over here. And then he says, "In Ashkenaz nogim latod al tzad yamin." We go a little bit to the side, not just move one's face like the Rambam says. Now we're already leaning on the right side. There's a midrash that says v'mino techabekeni. One should lean toward the right side. And he quotes this other Gemara over here, Rav Chia bar Rav Huna Chazina Dlabai Rav the Chinaflu Apayu Matzli Atzluye. Rav Chia bar Rav Huna saw that when Abai and Rava prayed, and they then fell down on their faces, they would Matzli Atzluye, which he says means they would lean to their sides. Even if they didn't have their hands and legs spread out, they would still be on their sides. So already you see that they were going similar to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur style, but then going a little bit onto their side. So you see that this is evolving. The Torah obviously is after the Rambam's time. He brings Rav Amram's prayer over here, Rav Amram's version, which is very interesting. You can see that it has a little bit of, it's reminiscent of the prayers that we are familiar with elsewhere in the Sidur, but not exactly our form of Tachanunim. But you also see here that even though he brought Rav Amram's version, we don't have, let's say, well, I opened up my Sidur, it tells me to say Psalm 6 in the Ashkenazic Siddur, and as Sfardic Siddur tells me to say Psalm 25. Where'd that come from? Good question. As we saw earlier, it should be perhaps be more open to a person deciding what he himself needs to say that day. I found for myself that just like, well, already 20 years ago, I didn't want to daven on autopilot, as the rabbi used to say in high school. So I used a different sidurs. Eventually stopped using the Ashkenazic siddur, switched to what's called Nusach Sfarad, which really is not that much different from Ashkenaz, except it has more awkward language. And then using the Edom Mizrach siddur. And by 20 years ago, I bought the Carlin Stolen siddur for various romantic reasons, and I really kind of like that one, even though it has the Geshim where there shouldn't be all over the place. And then I became familiar with, after rotating through these Sidurim for a few years, Rav Shaki's first Nusach Eretz Yisrael Siddur, which I bought from Rabbi Bar-Hayim. And I eventually got to use his third Siddur and various other ones, so as not to daven on autopilot, as they say. So too, with regards to Tachnunim, for just because I wanted to stay on my feet, I decided that instead of just sticking with Psalm 6 and Psalm 25, there's many Tehillim there. Basically start with the book of Tehillim, keep that in my talis bag, and every day say a different psalm. Of course, the psalms that are appropriate for Tachnonim. Certainly the first 5 psalms before the 6th one are appropriate, and there are many others. The Hallel, the daily Hallel, that's the last few psalms, and the Hallel Mitzri, Hallel Gadol, the various other songs of praise are not fit for Tachnonim, but the vast majority of psalms are. And quite a few of them speak to me personally, so I use those instead. He also brings what Rav Natranai says, that apparently this Nefilat Apayim in the Tzibur is just a reshut. What does that mean? Well, if they don't want to, I guess they don't have to. Well, Arvit is also a reshut apparently, so it's not like they could just skip it. But I guess we're more lenient with regards to it, and you can understand why it is that the tendency in Jewish history has been to eliminate Tachanun in more days. I remember there were people who still said Tachanun on Lag BaOmer. There are people still insisted Tachanun should be said on Pesach Sheni, which is a nothing, even in temple times, if there was no reason to have Pesach Sheni. On Tu B'Shvat, what's so happy about Tu B'Shvat? It's just a cutoff date for tithes and things like that when we have agricultural commandments. So why leave off Tachanun on all these examples? And as you know, Hasidim, they have all these more cases. More and more, we're leaving off Tachanun when we should be saying it, apparently. And we only add to this list. Eventually, if we continue, there will be no days left in the calendar to say Tachanun, and that cannot be. It's a very important facet of our prayer. So perhaps it's time, just like Rav suggested once, that we have to go back to square one. Too many minhagim are crowding out the actual halachot. Perhaps we should go back to the way it was in, let's say, the way the Rambam describes. We just don't say Tachanun on Chanukah, Purim, Chol Hamoed, Rosh Chodesh, and of course the Sabbaths and Yomim Tovim. But all the other days we should. And then, of course, the idea that we leave off Tachanunim because there are certain people in the synagogue, I can understand why, let's say, a fellow who served as a mohel in the morning would not say Tachanun later that day. It's still his Yom Tov. But the fact that all these strangers in shul who are praying as normal should suddenly not say Tachanunim at Mincha time because this fellow is now praying with them, that's a little bit of a stretch. Yes, it's an old minhag, but perhaps there's some Rishonim who would say that we have to get back to basics. But that still is up in the air. So, like they say, tzarich iyun. It says here that the Shatz has other prayers to say. And they give a nice drash over here. We found that Moshe Rabbeinu, when he would pray, it says that he himself says, I sat there on the mount in prayer. Anochi va'eshev bahar, he says, I sat on the mountain. And it says, Va'anochi amadti vahar, I stood at the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. And then he says twice, Va'at napal, I fell down in supplication before God on the mountain. So Moses himself sat and stood and then fell on his face. So too, our prayer consists of sitting. That's for the Kriyat Shema and its brachot, and the psukim is beforehand. Standing is specifically for the Amidah, the Shmon Esrei, and the falling down on one's face is for the Tachnunim. And we add some Tachnunim also over here after actual Tachnunim. We start Ashrei, Uvel Etzion. Uvel Etzion is basically a form of Tachnunim. And we could now make an important statement with regards to what Tachnunim are not said. If these are Tachnunim, this Uval Etzion is a form of Tachnunim, we know of no day in the Jewish calendar when we do not say those forms of Tachnunim. But what are they exactly? The lowest level of Tachanun is what you and I know as Tachanun. And that can be canceled because, for example, it's Rosh Chodesh, so don't say it. But we still say the regular Shmon Esrei. The regular Shmon Esrei is still those 18 or 19 brachot. And they ask, we are asking God for our daily needs. And we know that those are left off on the Sabbaths and Yomim Tovim, because those are also forms of supplication that are inappropriate. Instead, we ask God for spiritual gifts. Kadeshenu b'mitzvotecha, tein chalkenu b'toratecha, sabainu mituvecha, samach dashenu b'shuatecha, prayers like that. And those replace what we would normally say during the Shemon Esrei of a regular day. Yet, those are actually quite similar to the Val Tzion supplications, which are never left off. So, certain Tachnonim are canceled easily. Certain ones it takes a Shabbat or a Yom Tov to cancel. That's what we call the ones in the Shemon Esrei. And other Tachnonim, which are of a higher spiritual level, asking God to allow us to have a greater share in understanding the Torah, those are appropriate for every day of the year. Then, for those who are more interested in this, we have the Rambam examples of other supplications that people include. He gives examples of certain types of prayers over here that you could say for your Tachnonim. And these appear in certain Sidurim. This, for example, appears in Rav Shaki's first Sidur Eretz Yisrael, but you don't find them in a lot of other places. The end part you do find in a lot of different versions, a lot of Sidurim. And it has the Tachnonim that close the prayer after the Ashrei Uvel Etzion, and here he mentions that 25th song. to be said with the Shir Shel Yom. So this basically is the what you and I know as the Avodas Yom prayers. And after the Shir Shel Yom, he has, Ein Kelokenu a little bit. They didn't say Pitu Maktoret as part of it. And he mentions here, this is Psalm 25. This is just the first line of that psalm, but that's what he's referring to in Shir Shel Yom. So that's the type of Tachlonim we could add, but it's not like the type of kind that would be canceled because it's even Shabbos and Yom Tov. These are even fit for saying on Shabbos and Yom Tov. We're not going to go into the exact words. We'll conclude before we take questions. The special Tachlonim of Mondays and Thursdays. There's a tradition, first of all, that Mondays and Thursdays are more appropriate for prayer because Moses ascended the mount on Thursday in order to attain the atonement for the people, and he came back down on a Monday. So those are the days also that the sages, or at least the Batei Din, if necessary, can decree a fast day in times of emergency. So too, eventually, Am Yisrael saw fit that we should have more Tachlonim on these days. There's a legend out there about the three Zakinim who were captured, and they were the ones who composed the Vahu Rachum prayer, which was eventually inserted on Mondays and Thursdays. The Rambam doesn't mention this. A lot of Rishonim might not have been familiar with this minhag, and even if there were those who were, they did not say to do this. So this is a very late addition, late so to speak. This has been around for centuries, but in terms of Judaism, which is quite ancient, this is a later addition. The fact that there's more prayers to be said on Mondays and Thursdays, and just like it was due to the influence of Kabbalah that the actual act of bowing down on one's face made it to the way of the dodo. It's also due to the influence of Kabbalah that there were more prayers said on Mondays and Thursdays. You go to, let's say, local Sephardic shuls here on Monday and Thursday, not only saying Vahu Rachum, they're basically saying Slichot and Vidui. Their Monday, Thursday editions are similar to what you'd find in an Ashkenazic shul in Chutz La'aretz on a Monday, Thursday fast day. That's how much more they add, and that's how much more they're adding on fast days in Ashkenazi land. So you have this idea that there's more to be said on those days, but you also notice that, and people should actually do this comparison, the Vahu Rachum additional prayers in the Ashkenazic Siddur are actually longer than their counterparts in the Nusach Sfarad or Nusach Idot Mizrach Siddur. Where did the missing words go? I don't know, but it's worth it. I don't know, say what you feel you can say and what you understand. It's best to understand what you're saying. Better less words and more kavanah than more words and less kavanah, or even more words by just saying them autopilot and running through them because, oh man, they're about to take out the Sefer Torah and they still have 4 more pages to go. That's not exactly what Tachlonim are supposed to be. And they say that one is supposed to stand up for this. Why would they say that? Stand up for it. We see that Tachanun specifically, the best way to do it is by falling down on one's face. And really standing up, if you look, according to the straight halacha, like you would find from studying, let's say, the Rambam, the Vilna Gaon, you see that really the sages only decreed that we stand up for Shmon Esrei and Chazarat HaShatz, which is a form of Shmon Esrei, and out of respect for the Sefer Torah when it's being moved around, when it's being brought to its reading place or being returned to its resting place. So one could technically sit down throughout the prayers, all of Pesukei Zimra. There's no reason to have to stand up during any of them. And so too, Kriyat Shema, brachas, and everything that's after Tachanun, one could sit through all of that, except if one is the Chazan. So why would they decree that one has specifically stand up for these additional prayers? And the answer is alluded to over here in the words of the Gonim that's brought by the Beit Yosef, that's brought by the Ri Abu Av. It's because it was a later takana. And if you're wondering, so what does that have to do with it? It was a later edition. The answer is in order to, there were people who would say, it's a later edition, we don't have to say it. In order to drive the point home that, no, we want you to be saying these prayers, the same Rabbanim who instituted them decreed that those people should stand up for it as a sign of respect. Lama Davar Domer, what is this like? For example, in some synagogues, they take the prayer for the state of Israel or the prayer for the soldiers and other such new prayers very seriously, and therefore everybody stands up for it. Really, there's no reason to pray, to stand up for those prayers, whichever version you're using. You're praying for the state, but people do, and they take that very seriously because that's new. Some people don't take it seriously enough, or they just they have a very derisive attitude toward it. Perhaps maybe they're correct. I don't know, but the point is they shouldn't be sticking their thumbs. They're sticking their fingers in people's faces about this. So they say you should stand up for it. So too, to show that something is important, and so even though it's new, we dafka have people saying stand up for it. But really, if it's accepted nowadays, no one's skipping the extra V'hu Rachum on a Thursday and Friday. So now there is no reason to dafka say, no, you have to stand up for this part. Adarabba, perhaps if what we were to return to the first practice, where Tachnuim are said during prostration, then one should fall down on his face and say the whole prostration, the whole V'hu Rachum in that position. And by the way, one of the other influences due to the Kabbalah is, as you probably know, the Ashkenazic practice, based on what we see here in the sources, is that at least the part of Nefilat Apayim, the part of Tachanun, is to be said while one is banged down, even if on one's hand, immediately follows Shemon Esrei. But in the Hasidic rite and in the Sephardic rite, the ones that are influenced by Kabbalah, there's usually something that interrupts that. Sometimes they're going to say the Shlosha Srei Midot, and they're going to say perhaps the Vidui before that. And it seems clear that, therefore, the old Ashkenazic practice was that in the Nefilat Apayim preceded V'hu Rachum and did not come after it. So, yeah, nowadays, I guess those of us who have a more romantic attachment to what was done, we should at least be aware of what was done. I think that now, under the influence of certain Sidurim and greater study of the Rambam, certainly people becoming more familiar with how prayer is to be conducted in the Temple Mount, there is this return to more prostration as part of prayer. I think that it is a good thing. I think it's always good to go back to the way things were done, the way the sages used to do it. One who walks in the ways of the sages is usually doing the correct thing. We'll stop there now.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.